Hello, my name is Andrew Pilecki, and my presentation is entitled Delegitimization and the Meta-Ethics of Intergroup Relations. An earlier version of this presentation was given at the annual meeting of the International Society of Political Psychology in Istanbul, Turkey on July 12, 2011. Bartal has defined delegitimization as the categorization of a group or groups into extremely negative social categories that exclude it or them from the sphere of human groups that act within the limits of acceptable norms and/or values, since these groups are viewed as violating basic human norms or values and therefore deserve maltreatment. Delegitimization has been described as a syndrome that colors the whole nature of intergroup relations. According to Bartal, delegitimization is a fundamental process that facilitates intergroup violence. Research conducted within the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has shown that delegitimizing perceptions of Arabs among Jewish Israelis is associated with fear and anger, participation in political violence, and resistance to compromising solutions to resolving the conflict. Employing a critical discourse perspective, Tiliaga has conceptualized delegitimization as, quote, being out of place, end quote, due to the fact that a group has violated, quote, normative place-appropriate conduct, end quote. In a series of studies consisting of interviews with middle-class Romanian professionals, Tiliaga found that participants justified prejudice towards Romanis on the basis that they had violated normative standards of behavior. For example, that they lived in dirt or were ungrateful for what the state had given them. Against the standards of civilized society, Romanis became objects of moral repulsion, which in turn legitimized their subordinate status in society. Unfortunately, there are a number of issues that have impeded delegitimization research and limited its impact within the intergroup relations literature. First, there has been a noticeable lack of integration between delegitimization research founded on Bartal's conceptualization and research that has employed a discourse analysis approach like Tiliaga. This issue, we believe, has exacerbated the overall problem of conceptual distinctiveness that has emerged within the intergroup relations literature. Namely, delegitimization is often treated as merely another instance of dehumanization and/or moral exclusion. Lastly, research on delegitimization has been largely context and issue specific, focusing on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in general and the delegitimizing perceptions and attitudes of Jewish Israelis in particular. As such, measures of delegitimization often contain items that are relevant to the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and cannot be used in other contexts. As a result, research employing a delegitimization framework has not proliferated within the literature. The purpose of our presentation is twofold. First, I will put forward a conceptualization of delegitimization that addresses the issues I have brought up. Thus, my presentation is mainly theoretical. Second, I will briefly introduce some preliminary research that my colleagues and I have conducted based on this conceptualization. We wish to conceptualize delegitimization as a rhetorical categorative process founded on the claim that members of a group have violated, or threatened to violate, a presupposed moral order and as a result are no longer afforded the same treatment than that afforded to members of other groups. In terms of this conceptualization, we wish to emphasize that delegitimization is both a rhetorical categorative process and a meta-ethical process. In describing delegitimization as a rhetorical categorative process, our definition is rooted firmly in social categorization theory. In doing so, we frame delegitimization as a distinctly intergroup process, with a profound impact on how in-group and out-group categories are perceived and understood. To review, social categories constitute discontinuous divisions of the social world and represent cognitive representations of self and others. The categorization of self and others within particular categories provides the foundation of group behavior as well as stereotypic perception. However, social categories do not reflect divisions as they exist within the social world. Rather, as Billig points out, the process by which an object is included or excluded from a given category is, in essence, rhetorical. In other words, social categories reflect differences among groups that have been put forward via argumentation. Social categorization, as argued by Edwards, is thus a form of social action that can be used for the purposes of persuading, blaming, justifying, etc. From this perspective, social categories should not be examined for what they are, but rather what they do. From a rhetorical perspective, the content used to construct categories becomes emphasized. To quote Tajfel, the process of categorization provides the mold which gives shape to intergroup attitudes, and the assimilation of social values and norms provides their content. Hence, the content of social categories is often derived from the ideological frameworks and master narratives that prevail with any given social context. Moreover, ideologically based categorizations are often tied to political projects that attempt to define relations among groups. Specifically, the boundaries of categories can be made to seem more or less permeable, allowing some groups to be part of the in-group category and others to be placed outside of it. Or, as illustrated by the work of Mahalingam, categories can be constructed with distinct essences that portray intergroup differences as natural. Delegitimization reflects the placement of members of a group into a delegitimized category. Such categories are constructed to fulfill political projects that attempt to reify the relations among groups for the purposes of justifying intergroup violence and/or intergroup inequality. The essence of a delegitimized category, from our perspective, is the claim that a presupposed moral order has been violated. Both Bartal and Tiliaga's conceptualizations of delegitimization note, respectively, that delegitimization is a process marked by the claim that basic and human values have been violated, or that normative, place-appropriate conduct has been transgressed. However, instead of focusing on the specific moral transgressions that underlie the construction of delegitimized categories, we wish to emphasize the process by which a moral order becomes viewed as basic, human, or normative in the first place. As such, we view delegitimization as a meta-ethical process. Briefly, meta-ethics is concerned with the meaning and status of moral judgment. According to Kalis, it addresses three questions with respect to the nature of moral judgment. What do terms like right, wrong, and good mean? What makes a judgment a moral judgment? And are moral judgments universal or relative to particular contexts? It is our contention that how groups address these questions has far-reaching implications for intergroup relations, as well as makes delegitimization possible. First, in determining what is to be considered right, wrong, and good, metaethical claims inform the moral order adopted by group members. This moral order, in turn, becomes the basis for legitimizing actions undertaken by the group. Specifically, actions that are perceived as reflective of what a group considers inherently right or good are viewed as legitimate, while those that do not are viewed as illegitimate. Second, in determining what is to be considered a moral judgment, metaethical claims can facilitate the moralizing of intergroup relations. Attitudes rooted in moral conviction are stronger, perceived to be more objectively based, more intolerant to dissimilar attitudes, and, as revealed by the work of Skitka and colleagues, leads individuals to favor outcomes that affirm their moral conviction regardless of the process used to achieve that outcome. Thus, by framing intergroup attitudes as a matter of moral judgment, groups can engender intolerance among its members as well as facilitate an, quote, ends justify the means, end quote, outlook with respect to actions undertaken against target groups. Third, metaethical claims that a moral order is universal allow for moral claims that reflect a specific group interest to appeal to the interests of other groups. As Lazar and Lazar demonstrate in their analysis of President Bush's speeches following the September 11th attacks, it is through this process that the U.S. war on terror was framed as a defense of universally held principles like freedom and liberty. As such, the September 11th attacks were able to be portrayed as an attack against, quote, all freedom-loving peoples, end quote, rather than just the United States. A universalizing moral order also helps establish the boundaries of larger moral communities. Specifically, adherence to a universal moral order becomes the basis of membership in this moral community. This process serves the strategic function of rallying support from other groups placed in the moral community and marginalizing those excluded. As illustrated by Kinsella, it was through the construction of a moral community encompassing civilization and juxtaposed against the community consisting of the barbarian that U.S. policy towards detained enemy combatants in military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan was justified by the Bush administration. Excluded from the moral community of civilization, combatants captured in these conflicts were not extended the protections afforded other civilized peoples through the Geneva Conventions. Therefore, our basic contention is that metaethical claims provide the basis for delegitimization. Specifically, in framing a moral order as existing somehow independent from the group by claiming that it is comprised of basic human or universal principles, metaethics underlies the construction of larger moral communities of which the in-group is a member. It is from this community, comprised of, quote, acceptable, end quote, groups, that a delegitimized group is excluded. Moreover, by determining what is to be considered good, right, and hence legitimate, metaethics underlies the moral order that delegitimized groups are perceived as having violated. Lastly, by placing intergroup relations within the realm of moral judgment, metaethics contributes to the moralizing of intergroup relations and the grounding of intergroup attitudes in moral conviction, which, as evidenced by the work of Skitka and colleagues described earlier, can facilitate greater intolerance and an ends justify the means outlook with respect to treatment of target groups. We believe that our proposed conceptualization has the following strengths. It integrates and expands upon previous theories on delegitimization. Specifically, it elaborates the processes by which the moral order identified by Bartal and Tiliaga is utilized for the purposes of delegitimizing groups. Given our emphasis on social categorization and the ideological content used in the construction of social categories, our framework recognizes that delegitimization is inherently an intergroup process that is inextricably linked to the social context from which it emerges. Lastly, we contend that our framework could potentially clarify the relationship between delegitimization and other variables that have persisted in the literature. Because delegitimization results in the exclusion of a group from a moral community on the basis that a group has violated a moral order, delegitimization can ultimately result in the group's exclusion from the scope of justice. Hence, delegitimization may be a mediating process by which groups are morally excluded. Moreover, given that delegitimized categories could potentially be constructed using dehumanizing content, particularly if a moral order is associated with being human, delegitimization could therefore result in the dehumanization or infrahumanization of other groups. We have started conducting research with U.S. and Jewish-Israeli samples that seeks to determine the metaethics that define the moral community of civilized peoples. Specifically, we were interested in finding the common traits, values, and behaviors that are perceived as indicative of civilized groups using open and closed-ended items. The purpose of this initial phase of research was to validate items as well as generate additional items for a proposed delegitimization measure that I will discuss in a future slide. However, one preliminary finding that we can report is that there is evidence from the quantitative and qualitative data that we collected that being civilized is associated with adherence to a moral order. For example, we asked participants to identify values that a group must adhere to for it to be considered civilized. This participant responded that civilized groups show, quote, respect what we consider ethical and moral in a general perspective, end quote. Thus, for this participant, adherence to a moral order perceived as natural or universal provides the basis upon which a group is viewed as civilized. Lastly, we presented participants with the following item. In contrast to non-civilized groups, civilized groups are distinguished by their ethical behavior, end quote. Participants responded on a scale from 0, strongly disagree, to 6, strongly agree. As shown here, Jewish, Israeli, and U.S. participants overwhelmingly endorsed this statement, again showing that adherence to a moral order is perceived as a defining characteristic of civilized groups. In terms of delegitimization, we are interested in examining the extent to which target groups are viewed as not being reflective of this moral order in comparison to most other groups. As stated previously, the point of our research has, up until now, been item generation. Once we have identified the values, behaviors, and traits that are viewed as indicative of civilized and non-civilized groups, we will use them as items in a proposed measure of delegitimization. The proposed delegitimization measure will consist of a question such as the one displayed here. Participants will be asked to evaluate members of target groups on a series of values, behaviors, and traits in relation to an unspecified community consisting of, quote, most other groups, end quote. We intend for this comparison group to, in essence, reflect the moral community of acceptable groups from which the delegitimized group is excluded. Responses such as this one would indicate that members of the target group are much more likely to engage in rape than most other groups. As revealed in the data that we previously collected, groups that engage in rape or murder or torture are perceived as uncivilized. Hence, the perception that a particular group is more likely to engage in such behaviors in relation to most others would reflect the perception that this target group is distinct from the moral community of civilized groups. In a proposed measure, therefore, the magnitude of difference between the response and the midpoint would reflect the extent to which a target group has been delegitimized. In the next phase of our research, we intend to refine the delegitimization measure, as well as determine its convergent and divergent validity with other measures. Lastly, we intend to determine its unique explanatory power with respect to support for intergroup violence and/or intergroup inequality in relation to measures of infrahumanization, moral exclusion, and dehumanization. This concludes my presentation, and I thank you for your time.